40,000 empty seats, not a single Filipino flag in the stands, and the world's most dominant tennis player standing at the baseline, staring into a hollow arena, wondering where everybody went. This wasn't a power outage. This wasn't a scheduling disaster. This was a movement, deliberate, coordinated, and devastatingly personal. Because when Alex Ayala's name wasn't on the semifinal schedule, her 2 million strong Filipino army simply refused to show up. And what happened next shook the WTA to its foundation. To understand why 40,000 seats sat vacant at a WTA semifinal, you have to understand what Alex Ayala has done to professional tennis in the span of barely 12 months. Because what she built didn't just change her career, it rewrote the rules of who gets to own a crowd. Ayala wasn't supposed to be here yet. She was the wild card nobody tracked, the name the broadcasters had to double-check pronunciation for, the 20-year-old from Quezon City who arrived at the 2025 Miami Open with no seeding and no narrative arc that anyone had scripted. Then she beat Madison Keys. Then Iga Swiatek, the world number 2, a 6-time Grand Slam champion. Then Jessica Pegula. One by one, names that defined the sport dropped at her feet, and the Filipino diaspora watching from Manila to Los Angeles to Dubai lost their collective mind. She became the first Filipino woman to reach a WTA 1000 semifinal, the first to crack the WTA Top 100, the first wildcard in history to eliminate 3 former Grand Slam champions at a single elite-level event. That wasn't a Cinderella story, that was a declaration. And her fans, they didn't just celebrate from living rooms, they moved. At the 2026 Australian Open, fans swarmed a court assigned to Ayala's first-round match, a court so small relative to the demand that people stood in the aisles, crammed into walkways, draped flags over every available railing. Tournament organizers hadn't prepared for this. Nobody had. Andy Roddick described the scene at Indian Wells weeks later with characteristic bluntness. This is the type of story you cheer for because it's great for tennis. Novak Djokovic called the surge of Filipino support a good problem for the sport to have. A good problem. That phrase would age in complicated ways. Because here's what was actually happening beneath the feel-good headline. At tournament after tournament, a pattern emerged that tournament directors noticed quietly at first, then urgently. When Ayala played, seats sold out before the draw was even confirmed. When Ayala didn't play, or when her match concluded, stadiums emptied with such sudden, total finality that players who followed her on the schedule walked into near silence. At the 2026 Dubai Tennis Championships quarterfinals, Goff defeated Ayala in a 6-0, 6-2 rout. Goff walked to the net, turned to face the crowd, a crowd that had waited hours past midnight, bundled in winter coats in the desert cold, and actually apologized to Ayala's fans for having beaten her. Because Goff understood something that tournament schedulers were still learning the hard way. The audience wasn't there for tennis. They were there for one specific person wearing a Filipino flag on her soul. By the time the WTA arrived at its marquee semifinal week, Ayala had climbed to a career high of ranking number 29. She had sold out every match in Dubai. She had turned Indian Wells into a Filipino festival, with fans making 2-hour drives from Los Angeles, holding signs reading Laban Ayala, Fight Alex in Tagalog, and staying until midnight in the California desert without complaint. One Filipino-American fan named Andrew Rivera told reporters simply, "This is the most Filipinos I've ever seen at this tournament." He said it like a man watching history happen in front of his face. And then the draw came out for the WTA semis. Ayala's name was absent. What followed wasn't disappointment. It was organization. The moment that bracket circulated on social media, the Filipino fan communities lit up simultaneously across a dozen time zones. WhatsApp groups, Facebook pages, Telegram channels, Twitter threads, the message traveled at a speed that no press release could have matched. Ayala would not compete in the WTA semifinal round, and within hours, the decision had been made collectively, without a single official announcement, they weren't coming. Understand what this meant in concrete terms. The Filipino diaspora represents over 10 million people living outside the Philippines, with approximately 1.7 million concentrated in California alone. They had demonstrated, tournament after tournament, that they weren't casual observers who drifted toward a tennis match as entertainment. They were a mobilized, passport-carrying, ticket-purchasing army that had fundamentally altered the economics of WTA attendance wherever Ayala competed. At Indian Wells, the BNP Paribas Open posted a day-in-the-life video featuring Ayala, a standard, almost throwaway social media post, and it accumulated 94,000 views before the tournament concluded. By far, not even close, the most watched piece of content the event produced that entire year. 7 top 10 players competed at that tournament. The most watched video featured the 20-year-old from Quezon City. That was the commercial reality tournament directors had come quietly to depend on. When Ayala wasn't present, that reality dissolved. At the semifinal venue, ticket sales for the sessions without Ayala's name on them remained sluggish in a way that defied the prestige of the occasion. Advance purchases stalled. Walk-in day sales collapsed. Staff who had coordinated crowd management logistics for Ayala's earlier round matches, logistics that included extra security, extended queuing areas, and overflow seating arrangements, found themselves preparing for the opposite problem: too much space, not enough people. Social media became a courtroom. Filipino fan accounts with hundreds of thousands of followers posted unified statements. They had purchased tickets specifically and only for Ayala's matches. With Ayala eliminated, they saw no obligation and no desire to attend. Some framed it in measured language. Others were direct to the edge of confrontation, asking publicly why a player who sells out every match she enters had received no structural accommodation, no scheduling protection, no main court guarantee, while her box office power had been enthusiastically exploited by the very tournaments that now face empty seats because of her absence. One viral post read, "We don't owe the WTA our presence when Ayala isn't there. We showed up, we bought tickets, we traveled. The moment she's gone, so are we." It spread to 400,000 impressions in under 6 hours. And in the middle of all this, scheduled to compete in the semifinal that nobody was coming to watch, stood Aryna Sabalenka, a world number 1, a 3-time Grand Slam champion, a player who had spent years building her own reputation as one of the fiercest competitors the sport had ever produced. She was about to walk into a building that felt like a library. Through all of it, the boycott, the viral posts, the backlash against Sabalenka, the WTA's uncomfortable silence, Alex Ayala said almost nothing. This was not passivity. Anyone who has watched Ayala compete understands that she processes everything, releases nothing prematurely, and acts from a position of considered intent. She had said after her U.S. Open match in Queens, playing near Little Manila in New York, "To be Filipino is something I take so much pride in. I don't have a home tournament, so to be able to have this community here, I'm so grateful. They made me feel like I'm home." She had said at Indian Wells, hours past midnight, after 2 hours and 43 minutes of tennis in desert cold, for them to make the effort to stay up late and stay in the cold and cheer me on, it really added to the feelings and the emotions. She had said earlier in her career, with the particular clarity of someone who had decided something privately long before announcing it publicly, "Being brave is the best thing I can do for myself." None of those quotes addressed the boycott. None addressed Sabalenka. None addressed the WTA's structural decisions. And yet, every one of them illuminated exactly what had happened at the semifinal venue with 40,000 empty seats. Ayla's fans weren't operating outside her spirit. They were operating inside it, amplified to a scale she hadn't anticipated and couldn't fully control, but fundamentally understood. "I did not expect this sort of fan base or crowd rallying behind me," she had admitted earlier in the season, with what sounded less like false modesty and more like genuine astonishment that the love had materialized with such velocity and mass. She had become, in the span of 12 months, the most commercially consequential player in women's tennis, not named Coco Gauff or Sabalenka, without a Grand Slam title, without a WTA 1000 trophy, without anything except a historic run through Miami, a U.S. Open first-round win that split a New York neighborhood with joy, and a personality that made people feel, across thousands of miles and dozens of time zones, that she was fighting for something larger than a ranking point. Wang Jinyu, a Chinese player, had tried earlier in the season to argue that her own fan base matched Ayala's Filipino support, a comment that read as competitive even to neutral observers because the scale of what Ayala commanded was genuinely without peer at her ranking level. Djokovic had acknowledged it. Roddick had acknowledged it. Tournament executives had acknowledged it with their scheduling decisions and their promotional videos. Even Gauff, after defeating Ayala in Dubai, had turned to face the crowd and apologized, an extraordinary gesture from a two-time major champion who understood in that moment that the audience's grief at her win required acknowledgement. What the boycott revealed, stripped of all political framing, was simple. Ayala's fans had developed a relationship with their player so specific and so total that they experienced her absence not as disappointment, but as absence of reason. The seats didn't empty because of anger. They emptied because without her, the event no longer held meaning for the people who had traveled to be inside it. That's not a protest in the traditional sense. That's devotion operating at a scale that sports organizations have rarely encountered and almost never prepared for. And quietly, privately, in whatever space Ayala kept for reflection between practices and interviews and late-night matches in cold desert air, she almost certainly understood every bit of it. Years from now, when tennis historians examine the late 2020s as the period when the sport's geography of fandom fundamentally shifted, they will trace a line directly through this moment, through 40,000 empty seats at a WTA semifinal, through a 20-year-old from Quezon City who climbed from outside the top 100 to world number 29 in 12 months, and in doing so, exposed every assumption professional women's tennis had ever made about where audiences come from and who deserves to be centered. The WTA has since moved, carefully, without fanfare, to address scheduling protocols that account for high-demand players in ways that go beyond their ranking alone. Tournament directors have begun holding internal conversations about how court assignments and session structures interact with fan base geography. The organization that once scrambled to explain why a first-round Ayala match had been crammed into a small court at the Australian Open now operates with an awareness that this question of audience development is inseparable from the question of player-specific scheduling. For Sabalenka, the moment crystallized something she probably sensed for months. Her dominance, genuine, earned, and sustained across 3 Grand Slam titles and years of elite-level competition, operated in a world where dominance alone no longer controlled the crowd. She had not lost on the scoreboard at the semifinal. She won the match. But she had played it in front of the kind of attendance figure that a WTA 250 event in a mid-tier city might generate. That's a specific kind of defeat, invisible in the rankings, permanent in memory. She will recover. She always does. Sabalenka's psychological resilience is as formidable as her forehand, and her competitive appetite has only sharpened under pressure throughout her career. But she will compete from this point forward in a tennis ecosystem where her dominance coexists with the knowledge that one player, not ranked in the top 25, not yet holding a Grand Slam title, not from a tennis traditional nation, commands more organic audience loyalty than almost anyone currently active on the tour.